Harkett picked up the imagery overlay Speyer had spent 4 hours annotating and dropped it in the trash can beside the door, without looking at it. Then he turned back to the briefing board and said, "To no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. We're not changing the route because the attachment has cold feet." The room had 11 men in it, Green Berets, most of them, plus 2 Philippine Scout Rangers and a liaison officer from the embassy in Manila who kept checking his watch. 8 of the 11 laughed. The other 3 kept their faces professionally still, which was its own kind of answer. Speyer didn't look at the trash can. She was already building a mental image of what she had annotated. 6 fishing boats tied up along the eastern bank of the Agusan tributary, none of them trailing nets, all of them positioned at 200-meter intervals along the exact stretch of river the team would have to cross to reach the gorge entrance. Fishing boats in the Philippines didn't anchor in straight lines at uniform intervals, unless someone had put them there for a reason other than fishing. She had pointed this out. Harkett had just answered. She was going to need a different approach. Staff Sergeant Dana Speyer was 29 years old and had been shooting since she was 7, when her grandmother, a Korean War-era widow from Billings, Montana who smelled like pine sap and burned coffee and had strong opinions about everything, pressed a .22 rifle into her hands in a field behind their property and said patience wasn't a virtue, it was a weapon, the most reliable one a person could carry, because no one could take it from you, and no one could see it coming until it was already too late. Speyer had believed her then, she believed her still. She was 5'3" and had been fighting for every slot, every qualification, every assignment, since the day she'd first put on a uniform. Attached to ODA 3124 as a technical specialist, the Army's polite language for a designated marksman operating outside her standard unit. She had known approximately 40 seconds after walking into the forward operating base outside Bayugan City that the team's opinion of that attachment was roughly equivalent to their opinion of the mud on their boots. Nobody had come to meet her at the helicopter pad. The brief had started 15 minutes early, when she'd walked in with her gear and her annotated imagery, and taken a seat near the front. Captain Harkett had looked at her, the way a man looks at a chair, that has appeared in a room where there is already sufficient seating. She had introduced herself anyway. That was the kind of person she was. The mission was a hostage extraction. A USAID agricultural contractor named Pemberton had been taken 6 days ago by a militant cell operating out of the Agusan Marsh corridor. Intel suggested she was alive and being held in a village compound approximately 12 kilometers from the FOB, accessible by a single viable route, through the river gorge that cut north to south through the secondary ridgeline east of the highway. Harkett's plan called for a night approach along the gorge's western bank, a crossing at the narrows below the compound, and a direct assault on the target building, while a 3-man element provided security on the ridge. The plan was clean. It was well rehearsed. It had the kind of confidence that comes from a team that has executed the same basic geometry 8 or 9 times across a deployment and believes their execution is the thing that makes it work. Speyer had spent 4 hours with the satellite imagery anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. She had noticed the boats. She had noticed the way the eastern bank's vegetation had been cut back at 3 specific points, cut, not grown back naturally, exposing clean sightlines across the water. She had noticed the flash of a vehicle roof visible through the tree canopy 400 meters south of the crossing point that the intel summary hadn't mentioned. She had raised her hand. Harkett had looked at her with the specific, patient expression of someone waiting for a formality to conclude. She had shown him the imagery overlay. He had dropped it in the trash. She filed that away somewhere quiet behind her eyes and kept thinking about the boats. After the brief, she went to find the team sergeant. His name was Rail, and she found him at the equipment cages doing what team sergeants always did before an operation, checking everyone else's work with the quiet, thorough attention of a man who has learned that other people's oversights become his problem. "I need 5 minutes," she said. Rail looked at her. He was a broad, weathered man in his late 30s, who moved like someone who had been injured seriously at least twice and had simply reorganized himself around the injuries. He had the kind of eyes that were always arriving at conclusions slightly ahead of the conversation. "Go ahead." She laid out the imagery on the hood of the nearest vehicle, The boats, the cleared sight lines, the vehicle under the canopy. Rail was quiet for a moment. You've looked at this several times. And the captain has looked at the intel summary. The intel summary is 48 hours old. Rail's jaw worked slightly. It was the specific movement of a man who has decided something but is still turning it over. The LT ran this route 3 months ago, he said. Same approach. Different situation, Speyer said. Someone with decent intelligence collection on this team's patterns would know that. Another silence. She could see him weighing it. The cost of going back to Harkett, the cost of not going back. The particular professional calculus of a senior NCO who has learned exactly when his captain would hear him and when he would not. Whatever you decide to do tonight, Rail said, and then stopped and started again. Whatever you do, you better be right. She noted that he hadn't told her to do nothing. She went to draw her gear. The patrol staged at 21:30 with the particular compressed energy of a team that has done this enough times to make look like something other than controlled tension. Speyer stood at the rear of the column with her MO-110 and her pack and watched the jungle night, receive the patrol one element at a time. Harkett moved down the line. He stopped at Speyer with the efficiency of a man who had already decided what he needed to say. Stay on my 6, keep pace. If you fall behind, you stay behind. He said it without heat, which somehow made it worse than heat. This team doesn't babysit. Understood, sir, Speyer said. Something crossed his face, not surprise, but the particular expression of a man who expected pushback and didn't get it and isn't entirely sure what to do with that. He went to the front of the column. The jungle at night in Mindanao was its own kind of pressure. Thick, wet, loud with insects and the distant sound of the river. The triple canopy killing any ambient light so that the world reduced to the 6 feet of night vision green directly in front of each person's face. Speyer had worked in this kind of environment before. She kept pace. She watched the eastern ridgeline above the canopy. She thought about the boats. She thought about what Rail had and hadn't said. She thought about Pemberton, who had been in militant hands for 6 days and was depending on 12 people getting a route right. 2 kilometers from the gorge entrance, she made her decision. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no clarity that swept away the doubt. The doubt was still there, full and real and specific. The knowledge that disobeying a direct order in a combat environment ended careers, that Harkett would make certain of it, that she was working on imagery analysis and pattern recognition, and a feeling in her chest that might be tactical intuition and might be anxiety, and she had no way to prove which one it was until the gorge answered for her. The doubt was there. She stepped out of the column anyway, turned east toward the ridgeline, and started climbing. The ridge was 300 meters above the gorge floor and approximately 800 meters from the river narrows. On a good day with a light pack, in daylight, it was 40 minutes of serious climbing. Speyer had her rifle, her pack, and the knowledge that the patrol would reach the gorge entrance in approximately 25 minutes. She climbed. The rain started at minute 12, not the light preliminary rain of a storm building, but the immediate committed rain of a typhoon's outer band, deciding it had arrived, dropping visibility through her night vision to something that required her to feel the rock with her hands as much as see it. The M1 on her back was lighter than the largest sniper systems. 22 pounds instead of 32. But at this angle on wet limestone, it was still a problem, still torquing her spine, still demanding the specific constant adjustment of someone carrying weight distributed wrong for what the body was being asked to do. She adjusted without stopping. At minute 19, her right foot went through a shelf of rotten limestone and dropped 8 inches into nothing before she caught herself on a root that held. She held still for 3 seconds, breathing, letting her heart rate come down from where it had just spiked. Then she found new footing and kept moving. At minute 27, she reached the first false summit, a ledge that offered a partial view of the gorge, but not the sight lines she needed for the eastern bank. She needed the actual crest. She had 6 minutes. She pushed harder. At minute 33, she came over the main ridge and dropped flat behind a natural rock formation at the crest with the gorge laid out below her and the river narrows visible through the rain, and her heart doing something that required her full attention before she trusted her hands on the rifle. She breathed 1 breath, 2. Then she picked up the rifle and looked through the scope. She found the first one immediately. He wasn't hiding, he was positioned. There is a difference that is obvious to anyone who has spent time studying how people occupy terrain. He was on the eastern bank's rock shelf, facing west, with what looked like an RPG launcher resting across his knees. She moved the scope, found the second, the third, checked the boats. The boats were not boats anymore. They were fighting positions, each one carrying 2 men, with weapons elevated and oriented toward the western bank, where the patrol would emerge from the tree line. She counted. 8 positions on the eastern bank, 2 men each, 16 fighters total, waiting in an ambush geometry that covered the entire crossing point with overlapping fields of fire. Exactly what she had told Harkett. Exactly what he had dropped in the trash. Her radio crackled, the team channel faint with distance. Lima 2, Lima lead, approaching gorge entrance, call your status. She keyed the radio. Lima lead, this is Speyer. I'm on the East Ridge. I have eyes on hostile positions. Eastern Bank, 8 confirmed fighting positions, approximately 16 personnel. The crossing is an ambush. Do not enter the gorge. A pause. Then Harkett's voice, crisp and cold. Speyer, report your actual position. East Ridge, approximately 800 meters from the Narrows. I have thermal and direct optical on their positions. They are waiting for you. You abandoned the patrol column. Sir, you have 16 fighters in a prepared ambush. You disobeyed a direct operational order. His voice had gone very quiet, which was not the same as calm. Stand down, get off this channel. When we return to base, you will. The first shot came from the eastern bank. It was not aimed at the patrol. It was a signal round, a single crack that echoed up the gorge, and what followed it was the specific eruption of a prepared ambush triggered before it was supposed to be. Because something in the patrol's movement had gone early, or one of the fighters had made a decision. The gorge was full of fire. Contact right, eastern bank. Rees is hit. Get into cover, move. There is no cover, it's a kill zone. Speyer was already working. The RPG position first. The man with the launcher was tracking the patrol's movement along the western bank and hadn't identified her elevation yet. She dialed the range, read the wind, gusting, unpredictable, the typhoon's outer edge, turning the air into something with opinions, and waited for the lull between gusts that her grandmother had taught her to find in any weather if you were patient enough to wait for it. The wind dropped for 2 seconds. She fired. The M110's report was swallowed by the rain and the distance and the noise of the firefight below. She was cycling the bolt before she confirmed the hit, but she confirmed it. The RPG position went still in the specific abrupt way of a position that has just stopped being a problem. She moved laterally along the crest. Always move after the shot. She found the second position. The team channel was chaos. She had stopped listening to it. She worked. Below in the gorge, something was changing. Not fast enough, but changing. The volume of fire from the eastern bank was dropping by increment as Speyer worked through the positions one by one, and the patrol was reorganizing. She could hear it in the radio traffic, the shift from raw chaos to the framework of trained soldiers beginning to function again. What is that fire from elevation? I don't know. I can't. It's hitting the eastern bank. Someone is shooting them from above. Then Rail's voice, cutting through everything else. Speyer, is that you on the ridge? She had the fourth position in the scope. Working, she said. A pause on the channel. When Rail spoke again, his voice had changed in a way she would remember later. Not warm, not performed, simply real. The voice of a man who has just understood something and is no longer performing any opinion about it. Copy, Speyer. Keep working. Position 4, position 5. The rain was absolute now. The typhoon's main band had arrived sometime in the last 15 minutes without her noticing because she had been too occupied to notice, and visibility through the scope had dropped to the point where she was working primarily off thermal. Heat signatures orange-red against the wet black rock of the eastern bank, shapes of men trying to understand where the fire was coming from. They were starting to look up, starting to scan the ridge. She had a window, and the window was closing. Position 6. A machine gun crew that had been suppressing the patrol's only possible withdrawal route. She took the gunner first, then the loader, then moved before their third man could orient on her muzzle flash. Rail's voice controlled. Positions 3 and 4 are down. Someone's clearing the bank from elevation. Harkett, who is firing from elevation? It's Speyer, sir. Rail said it flat, without inflection, without commentary. She's on the east ridge. She's been up there the whole time. A silence on the channel. The specific silence of a man arriving at something he doesn't want to arrive at. Then quietly, how many can she still reach? 2 remaining, maybe 3. Speyer found position 7, found position 8. By the time she was done, the eastern bank was still. She lay on the ridge crest with the rain driving flat across the rock, and her rifle hot in her hands, and the gorge below her no longer a kill zone. The extraction took 40 minutes. Ruiz had taken a round through the upper arm, serious but not fatal, and Rail had him packaged before Speyer reached the patrol's position at the gorge mouth. She had descended the ridge in the rain, slower than the climb, her hands bleeding from limestone edges. She couldn't see in the dark, and she found Harkett waiting at the tree line. He was standing. She had expected that. He had been grazed across the left shoulder. She could see the field dressing under his shirt sleeve, and he was standing the way certain men stand when they have decided that the injury is not yet real until they decide it is. He looked at her. She looked back. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked at her right hand, a cut across the palm from the descent, still oozing dark in the rain. "Rock," she said. "I'll deal with it at base." "Nasser," Harkett called without taking his eyes off her. "Get the medic over here." "Sir, it's not." "Speyer." His voice stopped her the way a hand might, firm and direct, without force behind it. "You're going to let someone look at that." She looked at him for a moment, at the thing his face was doing that it hadn't done in the briefing room or at any point in the last 12 hours. Whatever it was paying attention, not to the mission, not to the tactical picture, but to her specifically. "Copy that," she said. The after-action review was at 0800 the next morning. Speyer attended with her right hand wrapped in a mild concussion that Nasser had diagnosed, and she had agreed not to fight about. The operations room had the same satellite map on the board. Someone had added markers to the eastern bank. 8 of them. Harkett ran the debrief the way she imagined he ran everything. Structured, chronological, no visible emotion in the delivery. He covered the route, the ambush, the casualties, the extraction. When he reached the section covering her actions, the room went very quiet. "Staff Sergeant Speyer," he said, reading from his own notes, "having identified indicators of a prepared ambush during mission planning, indicators this commander dismissed, made an independent decision to establish overwatch on the East Ridge without authorization." He looked up. "That decision was in direct contravention of my standing order. It was also the decision that kept this team functional through the ambush." Nobody in the room moved. The record will reflect both of those facts. After the debrief, when the room was clearing, Rail stopped beside her in the doorway. "I should have pushed back harder in the brief," he said. "You came to me with the imagery. I told you to be right and walked away." He looked at her directly. "That was on me." Speyer looked at this man who had spent a career being right and was now standing in front of his team, telling them where he'd been wrong. She understood what it cost him to do it. She understood the cost, because she had spent 7 years paying the opposite version of it, the cost of being dismissed, of being the one who wasn't listened to. But the cost of admitting you were wrong was its own particular weight, and he was carrying it without flinching. "I know," she said. "Thank you." Harkett came to the medical bay that evening. She had been expecting Nasser for the follow-up concussion check. When the door opened and it was Harkett, she had approximately 1 second to arrange her face before he saw it, tired and hurting, and more human than she'd allowed herself to be in front of any of these men since she'd landed in Mindanao. He pulled the chair to the side of the cot and sat down without asking. "Ruse is going to keep the arm," he said. "The surgeon said another 2 centimeters and that answer would have been different." A pause. "Another 6 minutes and the answer on the team would have been different in a direction we don't come back from." She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could add to that accounting that would improve it. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'd like to finish before you respond." She waited. He looked at his hands. The hands of a man assembling words in an order that didn't come naturally, for a man who had spent his career in rooms where the words were already decided. I was wrong, he said, about the route, about the imagery, about the way I ran the brief. Each sense arrives separately, the way things are said when the speaker needs each one to land before adding the next. I made a tactical error, a command error, and he stopped, started again. A personal error in how I treated you from the moment you walked into that room. The medical bay was very quiet. I've been running teams for 9 years, Harkett said. 104 combined operations across 4 theaters. I have never had a specialist come into my brief with that quality of preparation and been dismissed in front of the whole team because I'd already decided what she was. He met her eyes. I decided what you were before I looked at what you could do, and that is what almost killed my team. Speyer had carried 7 years of rooms exactly like that briefing. Rooms where the verdict came before she opened her mouth. Rooms where the folder was dropped in the trash. She had carried all of it in the place behind her eyes where she kept things that couldn't be put away yet, and she had not let it slow her work because she had understood, even when it cut, that the work was the only answer to it. She had imagined occasionally what it would feel like when someone said this. She had imagined it would feel like winning. It felt like something quieter, something closer to simply being seen, for the first time in a long time, by the specific right person in the specific right moment, and the complicated weight of that was its own thing entirely. I appreciate that, she said. It was inadequate. She said it anyway because it was true. Something shifted in his face, not a smile. Harkett's face seemed constitutionally arranged against full smiles, but a shift in that direction, brief and real. The after-action report goes up the chain tomorrow, he said. The full version. The paragraph about your actions goes with it as written. He stood, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and turned back. What he said next was not an apology, and not an acknowledgement, and not a tactical assessment. It was just the thing that was true, stated plainly, by a man who had decided to stop managing the distance between himself and the truth. In 9 years, Harkett said, I have never seen anyone do what you did last night. He left. She lay back on the cot and looked at the ceiling and felt the cut in her palm and the concussion and the ache in her shoulders from 800 meters of wet limestone in the dark. And she thought, okay, just that. Okay. The chow hall at 1900 was mostly empty. Speyer took a tray and sat at the end of a table near the wall, the way she had sat in every chow hall and operations center and briefing room for 7 years, near the wall, at the end in the position that required the least negotiation of other people's willingness to include her. She was halfway through her food when the door opened. Rail came in first, then Nasser, then Odom, then Brim, then Calder, then 4 others, then Harkett, last because commanders come last. They came through the door and looked at her. Speyer looked back. There were other tables. The chow hall had 10 of them. There was no reason, tactical, logistical, or practical, for any of these men to sit where they sat next. Rail walked to her table and pulled out the chair directly across from her and sat down. Nasser sat beside him. Brim sat beside Speyer. The others filled in around the table, not at the ends, not at a polite distance, but right there packed in together, the way you sit with people when you've decided where you belong. No speeches, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of anything. Just men sitting down because they had made a decision about something, and the decision was itself the entire statement. Speyer looked at her tray. She picked up her fork. She kept eating. Odom passed the breadbasket without being asked. Calder poured himself coffee and poured a second cup without asking if she wanted one and set it beside her tray. Rail was already talking to Nasser about something logistical and mundane and normal, the way men talk when the emergency is over, and the ordinary is being reassembled around them. Harkett sat 3 seats down and caught her eye once, briefly, before looking back at his coffee, back to whatever a man like Harkett does with night like that one when the night is finally done. She looked away too, back to the table that was now full of people who had voted with their feet. She thought about the brief, about the imagery overlay dropped in the trash, about 8 positions on the eastern bank, and the fishing boats nobody had looked at twice. She thought about the ridge in the rain, the limestone shelf that gave way, the moment her foot found nothing and she found it again. She thought about her grandmother in a field outside Billings with pine sap on her hands, telling her that patience wasn't a virtue, that it was a weapon, the most reliable one a person could carry. She had been patient for 7 years. The food tasted exactly the same as it always had. The room looked exactly the same as it always had. And everything in it was entirely different. Outside, the typhoon was finally moving on. The sky above the fob was beginning to clear. Star by star, the way it always cleared after a storm moved through, gradually, and then completely, until the whole thing was open and dark, and full of more light than seemed possible after everything the night had held. She had always been enough. She had just needed a ridge in the rain to prove it.